"You're not on the list," the guard had said. 4 words. Clipped. Unapologetic. Delivered with the smug certainty of someone who thought he'd just caught a fraud trying to bluff his way into a world he didn't belong in. At first glance, it looked like a routine misunderstanding. A high-end concert in Santa Monica. Tight security. A long line of A-listers and VIPs with lanyards and wristbands and entourage drama. Then came a black man in a sharply tailored midnight blue blazer, holding his digital pass like everyone else. Nothing about him was disruptive. Nothing about him was wrong. Except, in that moment, everything about him was suspicious. To the gatekeeper at the VIP entrance, his skin tone and solo arrival screamed imposter. The guard didn't ask questions. He didn't rescan the barcode. He didn't even raise an eyebrow when the pass clearly turned green on the screen. He simply crossed his arms, looked him up and down, and declared, "You're not on the list. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in the world, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because corporate accountability starts with us refusing to stay silent." The man was Michael Reed, founder and CEO of ReedMetrics, a tech analytics firm quietly powering major segments of the global entertainment industry. His company was the lead sponsor of the evening's multimillion-dollar music festival, a weekend-long celebration featuring Grammy winners, tastemakers, and a media rollout that would reach 110 countries. Michael wasn't there to be seen. He wasn't walking in for attention or selfies. He was there to observe the operations, the energy, the return on investment. He had arrived without assistance or security because he didn't need them. Power, when real, doesn't scream. It watches. It listens. It walks in quietly and changes everything. Except tonight, Michael Reed didn't walk in. He stood calmly at the entrance of the VIP sponsor suite, while a security guard named Jake, 26, fresh off a contract with a local firm, drew a thick black line across the evening's social contract with one assumption: that a black man standing alone in front of the platinum entrance couldn't possibly belong. "No record under that name," Jake muttered as he turned his screen away. As if shielding confidential state secrets, he refused to let Michael even glance at the check-in list. The digital pass, valid and time-stamped, pinged again. Green. Verified. Didn't matter. Jake motioned to a second guard. "We've got someone trying to push through VIP," he said, loud enough for a small cluster of guests nearby to hear. Phones lifted. A few heads turned. A man holding 2 cocktails whispered to a woman in sequins. "I don't know who he is. Maybe someone's assistant." What they didn't know, what Jake didn't know, was that Michael Reed's sponsorship dollars had literally built the media platform broadcasting this event. That the code embedded in the festival app, the same code checking those passes, was a licensed engine built by ReedMetrics. That the glowing LED screens looping sponsors' names would soon pause and blink if a certain protocol was triggered. But Michael said nothing. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, expression unreadable, as the guard doubled down. The invitation code? Fake. The ID? Sketchy. The demeanor? A bit too confident. Behind Michael, a small crowd had started to build. Not out of concern. Out of curiosity. What was the holdup? Why was the line stopped? A few people began filming surreptitiously at first, and then more deliberately. The kind of slow-simmer phone capture that starts with a "this is weird" and ends up on a viral thread titled #gatekeeping at its finest. Michael's phone buzzed. 3 missed calls. His CFO. His chief of partnerships. His senior marketing lead. All already inside, wondering why the keynote sponsor hadn't arrived. He texted back a single word: delayed. Inside the venue, high above the entrance, LED signage flashed. "Welcome to Solstice Fest, powered by ReedMetrics." And yet, outside, the man behind the name stood like a stranger, encircled by guards, his legitimacy on trial without ever having spoken a word. The irony was rich. ReedMetrics was founded on the principle of predictive inclusion, algorithms built to eliminate bias in hiring, access, and content distribution. Michael had dedicated 15 years to building tools that other companies used to prevent the very behavior he was now facing in real life. And still, this moment wasn't new to him. The disbelief, the delay, the dissection of credentials that had already been verified. He'd been here before, though not in this exact setting. Once at a shareholders' gala. Once during a speaking engagement. Once, unforgettably, when he was the opening keynote at an AI ethics conference and security escorted him out for loitering. Tonight, though, the stakes were different. Because tonight, his company's sponsorship contract included a clause. One that had been added, quietly but purposefully, during final negotiations with the festival board. A clause that allowed for immediate termination of partnership, funding, and tech support if Reed Metrics, its employees or representatives were subject to discriminatory behavior during any aspect of the event. A clause that activated not with legal posturing or press releases but with a text. One word. Triggered. Michael hadn't sent that text. Not yet. But as the minutes passed, as the guard continued insisting, he's just doing his job. And as someone whispered, maybe he should try general admission. The silence around Michael Reed took on a weight, a poised, calculating stillness. He looked around not for help, not for sympathy, just to see who was watching, who was filming, who was witnessing the moment when a festival would unknowingly begin unraveling from the very edge of its red carpet. 12 minutes had passed. The crowd swelled. The screens kept cycling his company name. And Michael's hand hovered over his phone. It was almost time. From a distance, it still looked mundane. A typical Saturday night scene. Music pulsing from within the venue, conversation rising like steam in the humid Los Angeles air, influencers adjusting outfits for photo ops, laughter peeling out from champagne bars tucked beneath velvet canopies, the usual chaos of exclusivity, a carousel of access. But at the edge of the gated VIP entrance, something else was happening. Something quieter, colder, and far more familiar than most people wanted to admit. Michael Reed had not moved from where he stood. Not because he was frozen or intimidated, but because he was calculating. Every detail, every word spoken around him, every gesture. The green confirmation still glowed faintly on the check-in tablet. A soft truth ignored by the man guarding the entrance. Jake, the security guard, hadn't wavered in his posture, but his voice had taken on an edge. Not loud enough to be a scene, but just sharp enough to frame Michael as a problem. He'd begun speaking to colleagues nearby, casually referencing a discrepancy and a possible misprint, manufacturing doubt in real time for anyone listening. None of them asked Michael his name again. None rescanned his pass. None verified his ID with the staffers inside. Instead, they just stood, arms folded, talking around him, over him, as if the issue were already settled. That's how it often began. With doubt. Not overt hostility, but a quiet dismantling of legitimacy. A ritual that unfolded in small acts of erasure. Ignore the confirmation, question the pass, question the intent, question the man. By the time they were done, the problem wouldn't be the system. The problem would be him. The crowd trickled around them like water past a stone. A few slowed, eyes flickering. Some lifted phones. Some turned away, too practiced in the art of ignoring what made them uncomfortable. And yet the tension, the unease, began to crack through the curated cool of the evening. Inside the venue, the show was gearing up for its headline performance. Bright visuals splashed across LED displays. The sound check vibrated through the concrete. The luxury sponsor suite, 3 levels above the entrance, bore Reed Metrics branding on all corners of its glass. And outside, its founder still waited. What made it unbearable wasn't the insult. Michael had outgrown the sting of that a long time ago. What gnawed at him now was the systematic ease with which it unfolded. These were supposed to be educated staff, a vetted events team. The venue prided itself on sophistication, on progress. The festival's entire campaign centered around inclusion. They had leveraged his name, his company's values, to sell that narrative. His contract was the cornerstone of their transformation campaign. From exclusivity to diversity, from elitism to openness. But diversity was easy to print on a banner. Equity was harder to find in the muscles of a system. And here it was again, clear as day. Power assuming it had the right to interrogate presence. The assumption that legitimacy wore a certain face, walked a certain way, came packaged in a different color. Michael had seen it in boardrooms and back offices, in cocktail receptions and corporate mergers. He had seen it disguised as curiosity, as just protocol, as unintentional, and he had documented every instance, silently, thoroughly. Tonight, that silence was reaching its limit. Behind the scenes, text messages began bouncing across internal group chats. Michael's senior events manager, already inside, was frantically messaging the head of the festival logistics team. "He's still outside," she typed. "What the hell is going on at the entrance?" Back at the gate, a young woman in a satin dress had paused nearby, phone in hand. She hadn't said a word, but her camera lens remained fixed on Michael's face. The stream had started rolling, quietly, invisibly, beaming his composure, his isolation, to thousands who didn't know what they were watching just yet, but soon would. One of the guards leaned closer to Jake, murmuring that a sponsor liaison had been pinged for verification. Jake responded flatly that there were plenty of fake badges floating around and you can never be too careful these days. The implication landed like lead. Michael had heard enough. Still silent, he turned his head slightly and glanced down at the small button embedded in his watch strap. It was synced to an emergency trigger on the Read Metrics event dashboard. If pressed, the system would send an automated hold command to the event servers, freezing all branded visuals tied to Read sponsorship. Logos would disappear. Interactive features would stall. Apps would glitch. Screens would darken without warning. But it wasn't time yet. He wasn't looking to create spectacle. Not until every thread of bias had been exposed. Meanwhile, a PR intern inside the festival lobby had begun sweating through her blazer. She was now 3 minutes into a frantic phone call with the head of strategic partnerships, describing how someone is filming and the sponsor hasn't entered, and this could go very badly. She wasn't wrong. Back at the gate, Jake had finally allowed another group of guests through, barely glancing at their wristbands. One of them, a tall white man in a trucker hat, joked as he passed Michael, "They giving you trouble, brother?" before chuckling and disappearing inside. Michael didn't laugh. He adjusted the cuffs of his blazer with slow, practiced control. Across the street, his private driver had now exited the vehicle. He stood quietly near the curb, watching. He'd been briefed on what to do if a certain command was given. The air had thickened around the VIP line. The security team could feel it too, but no one said it out loud. The crowd had grown dense and uncomfortable. Guests began whispering. Some staff hovered nervously around their radios. Something was shifting. They just didn't know yet that it was about to break wide open. Inside the control tent, one of the digital content operators noticed a strange glitch. An automated banner cycling between event logos had just blinked off mid-sequence. She flagged it to her supervisor, who shrugged. "Probably just a sync issue," he said. It wasn't. It was the system preparing to erase itself from their screens. All it needed now was one signal from Michael Read. The man they didn't let in. The man they didn't question but still denied. The man they would soon realize wasn't just on the list. He wrote it. It began with a whisper, then a phone tap, then the unmistakable sound of a live notification pinging on someone's Instagram story. And suddenly, Michael Read wasn't alone. He hadn't moved from the velvet rope, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything to invite attention. But the moment the crowd sensed something was wrong, that the calm, dignified black man standing at the VIP gate had been standing there far too long, the air around him began to shift. The edge of the evening's glitz dulled. The undercurrent of discomfort, once ignorable, began to spread like smoke. The line to the exclusive sponsor suite wasn't long. Not for people whose names graced guest lists. But even among the elegantly disinterested, people were beginning to glance backward. A few craned their necks. One woman, holding a flute of Prosecco and wearing a gold-fringed dress, murmured to her partner, "He's still out here?" She wasn't asking anyone in particular, but her tone wasn't casual anymore. It had weight, concern. The pass in Michael's hand still glowed a soft green on the screen. Scanned, verified, authenticated. But the guards no longer addressed him. Instead, they began addressing each other, whispering, nodding, shrugging. Still, they didn't let him pass. They hadn't checked their records again. They hadn't confirmed with anyone inside. They hadn't asked for assistance. They were simply waiting for him to leave. But he didn't. He waited. Around him, the attention gathered not like a scene, but like a question. What was going on? Why wasn't he inside yet? Was something wrong? Was it something else? One woman stood a little closer, pretending to scroll through her phone while secretly recording. Another man, a tech executive himself, recognized Michael, not just from his keynote at CES last year, but from an op-ed in Fast Company that had gone viral. Michael Reed, he whispered to his friend. That's him. Reed Metrics. He's the guy. And still, Michael remained still. The beauty of his silence was its restraint. He wasn't trying to draw a crowd. He was forcing the moment to speak for itself, because it was already speaking volumes. From within the venue, through the tinted glass panels of the second-floor sponsor deck, the words presented by Reed Metrics flickered like a cruel irony. Every monitor, every rotating stage banner, every program booklet bore his company's logo. The entire infrastructure of the festival's data tech, pass scanning, heat mapping, sponsor analytics, ran on his firm's platform. They weren't just hosting him. They were dependent on him. But outside, at the door, they had failed to see him. It's a particular kind of wound, one shaped not by violence but by refusal. A wound made deeper not by being pushed out, but by being politely, deliberately kept just outside the boundary. Invisible. Because when power doesn't look like what people expect it to, they dismiss it without blinking. That dismissal was unfolding in real time. Across the plaza, more phones were lifted. A local influencer had just tagged Michael's location with the caption, "Wait, why is the sponsor of the festival locked out of VIP?" Within 5 minutes, it had 2,000 views and climbing. Someone else posted a blurry photo of Michael's scan pass, along with a close-up of the glowing green verification. A comment beneath it read, "Y'all, it's verified. They're just not letting him in. This is wild." And just like that, the silence fractured. A bartender wheeling in a cart full of glassware paused near the side rail and watched. A security contractor on break turned to face the entrance. Inside the control tent, one of the event producers, finally alerted by a frantic assistant, began checking texts about a potential incident involving the primary sponsor. But by then, the damage had already taken root. It's one thing to be excluded. It's another to be excluded while people watch. And this wasn't just being watched. This was being documented. Every moment captured. Every sidelong glance recorded. Every failure to act etched into time-stamped footage that would soon be dissected, quoted, looped, and remixed for audiences far beyond this gated plaza. What made it worse was that those tasked with keeping order still didn't understand what they were looking at. Jake, the first security guard, scoffed at a guest who muttered something about the incident. "Not my fault the system glitched," he said under his breath. But the system hadn't glitched. The system had worked. Michael's credentials were valid. His entry was approved. His presence was authenticated. It wasn't the system that failed. It was the people entrusted to interpret it. They had seen his face, made a decision, and turned a protocol into prejudice. Inside, the event was in full swing. DJ booths lit with LED fire. Artists conducting interviews. Microphones branded with sponsor logos. And above the main stage, Michael's company name glowed, flickering in slow rotation like a lighthouse. One that pointed to a truth no one inside could yet see. Their entire stage sat atop a foundation of erasure. And outside, its architect was being told he didn't belong. As the crowd thickened, as the whispers spread, as the phones filmed silently in all directions, the tension grew not louder, but heavier. It was no longer just about one man at the gate. It was about what he represented. He wasn't just being blocked. He was being witnessed. Some staff were now aware. A junior sponsorship coordinator was rushing across the back lawn, headset bouncing as she pushed through guests, trying to reach the entrance. She knew what was unfolding, knew how it would look, but she was too late. The internet had already arrived. And inside Michael's breast pocket, his phone buzzed. Not a call, not an alert, a trigger. The back end of the ReadMetrics event platform had detected multiple incident tags referencing his name, his image, and the festival. The algorithm had flagged it as a PR anomaly. As protocol, it had queued a shadow notice to the legal team, a media freeze suggestion to the brand consultants, and a time-stamped archive of every public mention of Michael Reed within a 2-mile radius. In 42 seconds, the system would prompt him to authorize a sequence. One that would dim every ReadMetrics display across the venue. One that would halt app syncing, disable interactive tracking walls, and temporarily suspend branded data visualizations on screens. He hadn't pressed confirm. Not yet, because sometimes the most devastating response isn't immediate. It's measured. He let the tension stretch a little longer. Let the crowd feel the weight of what was unfolding. Let them ask the question that every bystander eventually faces. If you saw injustice happening, what did you do next? And for the first time, people began to answer. Not with noise, but with witness. And that, more than anything, was the moment everything began to change. There's a distinct moment in every story of quiet power when the shift happens. Not with fury, not with chaos, but with a calm so rooted it unsettles everything around it. That moment had arrived now like a pressure drop before a storm. The crowd had grown, not in noise but in awareness. Phones had multiplied. The festival's curated energy, once tight and electric, now felt porous. Leaking confusion, leaking discomfort, leaking shame. And yet Michael Reed, the man at the center of the disturbance, still hadn't moved. The guards, no longer so certain, exchanged uneasy glances. They had stopped issuing new commands. Their posture had gone from confrontational to tentative. But they were too far in. Backpedaling now would be its own kind of failure. Michael didn't need to speak to make it clear. He was waiting for someone. And they were late. Not late by the clock. Late in responsibility. Inside the tented sponsor suite, Chloe Fenn, the festival director, was having her second drink of the evening and her third back-to-back conversation with VIP partners. Her phone had been buzzing intermittently, but she'd ignored it. The first message had said something vague about a check-in issue. The second had mentioned Michael's name. It wasn't until her brand manager's text flashed in bold. "You need to go to the entrance. Now." That something inside her tightened. She checked the time, scanned the sponsor list. Her breath hitched. Then she saw it. A message from the ReadMetrics Partnerships team. "Please confirm that Mr. Reed has safely arrived." The pit in her stomach opened like a canyon. She didn't run. Not quite. But the speed at which she left her VIP circle sent a clear message. Something was wrong, and it was serious. When she emerged through the curtain and stepped out into the warm night air, she saw it immediately. The crowd, the silence, the attention turned toward one man standing completely still. He didn't need to say a word. The scene spoke for itself. She had known Michael Reed only through business meetings and boardrooms, spaces where he exuded precision and a kind of clean, measured force. He was the kind of man who made decisions that moved industries, yet carried himself as if presence, not volume, was the highest form of power. And now here he was, standing at the entrance to an event funded by his company, ignored, delayed, and presumed to be a mistake. Her mistake. Chloe had worked her way up in an industry where optics ruled everything. She knew how fast reputations could fall. But this wasn't just reputational. It was structural. It was public. And it was unfolding under a growing sea of cameras. She approached, her smile tight, her voice strained with performance. But he didn't need the apology. The apology wasn't for him. It was for the people watching. He had never needed her validation to prove he belonged here. The badge on his lanyard said so. The emails she'd signed confirmed it. The $50 million contract her team had bragged about in every press interview guaranteed it. The question wasn't whether he belonged. The question was whether she understood who had been erased at her gates. The sponsor's lounge behind her shimmered with cocktails and curated playlists, but its credibility was starting to dissolve. News of the gate incident was now trending locally. Event photographers whispered to each other. Influencers passed the story from one hand to the next like a secret everyone already knew. Inside the control booth, something even more unsettling had begun to happen. The ReadMetrics platform, which powered all the event's live data visualizations, had entered what was internally known as low-fidelity standby mode. Screens slowed. Tracking walls glitched. Sponsor impressions froze mid-cycle. QR check-ins began to stutter. The system, quietly responding to a protocol embedded in its architecture, had activated a failsafe, a digital signal that something was wrong at a core access point. It was a mirror of Michael's presence at the gate. Everything was working on paper, but it was slowing, questioning, refusing to keep functioning without acknowledgement. Michael didn't call for anyone. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at Chloe, not with malice, not with outrage, with clarity, and that was the part that unsettled her most. Because the moment she met his eyes, she understood. The story was no longer under her control. Not the narrative, not the timing, not even the tech. All he had to do was confirm the command already rippling through the back end of the system. One touch on his device and ReadMetrics would withdraw. Sponsorship visuals would vanish. The festival's analytics dashboard would collapse. And Chloe Fenn would be the woman who lost $50 million and public trust in under 15 minutes. She tried to reset the balance. She motioned toward the guards, who now looked like children who had broken something irreplaceable. She offered to walk Michael inside herself. But power doesn't rush. So he paused. Not to delay, but to demonstrate who was setting the pace now. He turned slightly toward the crowd, not to perform but to let them see. Let them understand that this was what it looked like when you erased someone too powerful to be erased. That this was how quiet retribution entered the room. Not in fury, but in undeniable presence. Then, and only then, Michael nodded once. Not to Chloe, to himself. The shift had begun. And no one, not Chloe, not the staff, not the audience, could stop what was coming next. Because power, once it remembers who it is, doesn't ask for permission. It reminds the room who built the walls. Some revelations don't need to be shouted. They don't need fireworks or fury. The most devastating truths are often revealed in whispers, delivered not as threats, but as facts so undeniable they flatten everything built on assumption. Inside the VIP sponsor suite, things were unraveling faster than anyone understood. Michael Reed had finally been ushered in. Not welcomed, not celebrated, just let in, as if undoing harm was the same as avoiding it in the first place. The awkward apology had already happened, caught halfway between sincerity and damage control. Staff members had scattered to corners, avoiding eye contact, pretending to fix things that weren't broken. But the silence followed him in. It clung to the walls, and it followed Chloe Fenn like a ghost as she walked behind him, her smile tight and brittle. She was still trying to manage optics, still clinging to the hope that perhaps this would fade quietly into the noise of the night. The PR team was already discussing internal miscommunication, language for a possible statement. Someone had suggested offering Michael an upgraded hospitality package, as if finger food and a balcony seat could undo public humiliation. But she hadn't seen what Michael saw. She hadn't seen the footage already circulating on Twitter, phones catching the exact moment the guard dismissed his pass. She hadn't read the comment threads calling out the hypocrisy of a festival branded inclusive, failing its very core sponsor. She hadn't watched as a clip of the incident was reshared on a Black entrepreneurship forum with the caption, "Money can't buy you dignity when systems are built to deny it." And she hadn't seen the dashboard light up on Michael's phone. It was quiet, just a faint pulse at the top corner of his ReadMetrics control screen. A small amber icon labeled Clause 17A, Status Ready. It wasn't a glitch. It was a clause, a contractual provision that had been buried deep in the sponsorship agreement. Michael's legal team had insisted on it, not out of cynicism, but as a matter of historical pattern. They'd seen this happen before. Power erased when it didn't look like power. Status challenged when it didn't arrive in the right package. Clause 17A was a safeguard, a single protocol that allowed the sponsor to revoke the contract if discrimination occurred. No need for drawn-out negotiation. No requirement for public justification. The language had been agreed to without objection because no one ever thought it would be used. But it existed, and tonight it had activated. While the festival staff scrambled to regain control, Michael sat alone in a quiet corner of the sponsor suite, tapping through the dashboard interface. Every branded asset powered by ReadMetrics was visible on his screen, every heat map, every impression log. And with one tap, he could pull all of it. But it wasn't revenge he was after. It was reckoning, because the insult hadn't just been personal. It had been systemic. It had been a failure of respect dressed up as protocol. It had been the kind of erasure so subtle, so practiced, it barely registered to the people who did it. They didn't think twice because they never had to. Until now, the event's media wall flickered again. Nothing obvious, just a momentary lag. A slight delay in the data cycle, but enough to signal to the technicians that something wasn't right. Behind the scenes, the production team was now trying to troubleshoot what they thought was a server sync issue. The branded QR check-ins had begun stalling. Analytics impressions weren't updating in real time. Guests were starting to notice that the interactive heat map, a centerpiece of the sponsor lounge, had gone dark. The system was still online, but it was no longer cooperating. Because it was his system. He'd built it, funded it, licensed it to them, and now it was responding to the truth. Its creator had been humiliated at the door. It was time for them to remember who had the keys. Michael's legal counsel, watching from a nearby suite, had already been briefed. Emails had been sent to the festival board. The activation of Clause 17A didn't require permission. It required only confirmation from the sponsor executive. And it had just been submitted. In less than 2 minutes, a cascade of changes would begin to roll through the infrastructure of the event. But Michael still waited. He wanted Chloe to hear it from him. Not as a spectacle, not for drama, but because she needed to understand. She needed to feel what it was like when the man they ignored became the man they depended on. So he stood. He walked over to where she was standing, attempting to manage the unraveling press table, and he placed a folder in front of her. She opened it, confused at first, until she saw the first page. It was the signed sponsorship agreement. Her signature, the clause highlighted in yellow, the timestamp at the bottom, and a second page, already printed, already dated, formally terminating the partnership. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a decision. Not out of pettiness, out of principle. Chloe's face drained of color. Her voice failed her. And still, Michael didn't raise his own. He didn't need to. The room felt it. Staff began receiving text messages from operations. A banner in the lounge froze. Someone from the media tent called out that sponsor feeds had gone offline. Photographers looked around, confused. A guest tapped her app, only to find a loading screen. It had begun, and not one of them could stop it. This wasn't an angry outburst. This was strategic decoupling. The erasure of a $50 million partnership, not for vengeance but for accountability. Michael turned once more to look at the screen behind the bar. It had once rotated festival stats, powered by his company's algorithm. It now displayed nothing but a blank gradient background. Quiet void, like the space between assumption and truth. And as he walked out of the suite, calm, upright, untouched by apology, everyone left behind felt the full weight of what had been revealed. Power had been standing at their door the entire time, and they never opened it. By the time the screens went dark, it was already too late. Inside the media control tent, a junior technician stared in disbelief at the wall of blinking monitors, each one running on software powered by ReadMetrics. The seamless interface that had guided the entire evening, from real-time crowd mapping to sponsor analytics and interactive visual projections, had gone eerily still. Not broken, just withdrawn. It began like a pulse fading from a wrist. No warning, no error messages. The brand banners simply paused mid-rotation. The check-in data dashboard stopped updating. A shimmering digital art piece in the center of the VIP lounge, powered by motion sensor tech provided through Michael's innovation team, froze on a half-loaded loop. There had been no crash, just absence. The consequences were elegant and terrifying. Chloe Fenn, still holding the sponsorship termination document in her hand, hadn't moved from her place near the bar. She had read every line of the contract, had signed it herself, had championed the Reed Metrics partnership in front of board members and media outlets alike. But in all her preparation, all her event planning, all her posturing, she had never once paused to imagine this moment. A multi-million-dollar system shutting itself off without even raising its voice. Because that was the nature of real power. It didn't yell. It executed. And now, across the venue, reality was unraveling like silk. The sponsor press booths, once illuminated by an endless feed of guest photos and interactive tags, were emptying. Journalists who had come to cover a digital transformation story were now filing tweets about a sponsorship collapse in real time. News trickled out fast, too fast for damage control. A backstage producer had already leaked the story to a freelance culture reporter. Reed Metrics had terminated the sponsorship contract mid-event following an incident at the entrance. Within 20 minutes, a popular tech blog ran with the headline, "Billion-dollar founder denied entry to his own festival. Responds by pulling the plug." From that moment, the event no longer belonged to its planners. It belonged to the public. And the public was furious. Screenshots of the gate interaction, caught from 3 different angles, were now plastered across social platforms. People weren't just upset at the discrimination, they were stunned by the precision of the response. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't stormed. He hadn't posted a single thing. He'd simply removed the foundation. Every activation booth, every sponsor ad campaign that relied on Reed's back-end infrastructure, every digital wristband entry scan. All of it now flickered in limbo. Not down, just revoked. Inside the operations tent, panic took root. Department heads were calling each other across shortwave radios with phrases like, "We're blind in Sector 4," and "We lost heat map data." And in the quiet center of it all sat Michael Reed, no longer present in body, but in full control of the system he'd designed to respond only to truth. The most painful part for the festival organizers wasn't the money. It was the exposure. Because as the infrastructure collapsed, so did the illusion of progress. They had built their brand on buzzwords: diversity, inclusion, innovation, partnership. But those words crumbled the moment they refused to see the man behind the code. The man whose presence at the door had been reduced to suspicion. In a dimly lit hallway beside the media corridor, Jake, the security guard who had turned Michael away, stood frozen in front of a supervisor. His voice, which hours earlier had brimmed with condescension, now stumbled over apologies he could no longer form. He had not been fired yet, but the call from corporate had already come. And with it, an internal review, a deeper look into his employment record, a re-examination of all discretionary calls made at events under his watch. Because now everything was on the table. The event had become a case study, not in innovation, but in failure. And Michael? He wasn't seeking revenge. He wasn't on a warpath to destroy careers. That had never been the point. The point was accountability. The point was that a $50 million partnership did not excuse you from being dismissed when you didn't look like power. The point was that no amount of strategic branding could conceal bias when it appeared in plain sight and was recorded by hundreds of witnesses. At Reed Metrics headquarters, miles away from the chaos, Michael's legal team had already compiled a full report. The company's crisis protocol wasn't reactionary. It was refined. For years, Reed Metrics had advocated for quiet reform inside boardrooms, designing products that companies used to track hiring equity, performance feedback bias, and customer satisfaction across racial lines. But tonight, the test came home. The system wasn't just a tool. It was a mirror, and it had reflected exactly what Michael knew it would. In the hours that followed, brands began calling. Other sponsors, tech partners, even competitors. Some were nervous. Some were remorseful. All of them were asking the same question. How do we keep this from happening to us? Because when Michael pulled out, so did trust. And trust, once revoked, cost more than the contract. It cost reputation, cost integrity, cost legacy. By morning, 5 more sponsors had suspended their own partnerships with the festival. 3 major artists issued public statements denouncing what had happened. One announced they would no longer perform unless accountability preceded applause. And Michael? He didn't speak to the press. He didn't post a message. He let the silence speak for itself. The same silence they had given him at the door, now returned, amplified. In that silence there was a reckoning, not just for the gatekeepers, but for the system that created them. The same system that gave them the authority to deny entry without cause. The same system that praised diversity in headlines but failed to defend it in practice. Michael had merely exposed it, and when he did, it fell apart, gracefully, elegantly, completely, because that's what happens when people confuse presence with privilege. They forget that the man they dismissed might also be the architect of everything they stand on. And when the architect walks away, the whole structure remembers who built it, and who can take it down. The story did not end with the screens going dark. If anything, that was the beginning, not of retaliation, not of spectacle, but of something quieter and more lasting. In the days following the incident, the silence surrounding the festival gave way to a storm of headlines, think pieces, and corporate disavowals. Public apologies trickled out, cautiously worded and clearly lawyered. The event organizers issued a brief statement referencing a technical misunderstanding at the gate. It landed flat. No one believed it. The footage had been too clear, the documentation too sharp, the damage too deep. But for Michael Reed, it wasn't about the headlines. He didn't do interviews. He didn't tweet his anger. He didn't correct the narrative spinning wildly across social feeds. He had already said what needed to be said, not through words, but through action. And now it was time to rebuild. He wasn't interested in burning down an industry. He was interested in re-engineering it. Inside the glass and steel walls of Reed Metrics headquarters, the fallout from the sponsorship withdrawal was being repurposed into something strategic. Michael gathered his leadership team not to assign blame, but to begin a full case study on what had happened. The goal wasn't to punish individuals. It was to understand how systems, even when well-meaning, failed those they claimed to serve. What had occurred at that velvet rope wasn't new. It was a reflection, a magnifying glass over an architecture built on bias, still operational, still normalized. But now, the man it had underestimated was choosing to write its next chapter. The first decision was immediate. Reed Metrics would no longer sponsor high-visibility events that didn't adhere to enforced bias mitigation protocols. Not performative checklists, not marketing slogans, actual measurable, accountable systems. The second decision was more radical. Michael announced the launch of the Entry Project, a $25 million initiative focused on building standardized access equity systems for event logistics, venue security, guest validation, and crowd protocol. Not just at music festivals, but in stadiums, museums, corporate retreats, and conferences. Places where implicit bias often hid behind laminated passes and VIP lists. The platform would be licensed for free to nonprofits and educational institutions. Corporations could use it, but only if they agreed to full audit visibility and third-party reporting. There would be no exceptions. Within 3 months, 5 Fortune 500 companies signed on. Because the thing about power, when handled with quiet integrity, is that it draws people who are ready to change. Michael's refusal to rage had opened space for reform. Not just externally, but inside the very venues that once excluded him. The festival that dismissed him? By the next season, its board had been overhauled. A new director, someone known for organizational empathy, not just profitability, had been appointed. Every contracted vendor was now required to undergo inclusion and dignity certification through a third-party agency. The very guard who had blocked Michael at the gate? His contract had ended. But quietly, Michael's team reached out. Not to retaliate, to invite. The guard was offered a 6-month scholarship to attend a training cohort run by the Entry Project. Because education, Michael believed, wasn't a privilege. It was a responsibility. And responsibility had to extend to those who had failed, not just those who had been failed by them. Across the industry, whispers of the Michael Clause began to circulate, referring to hidden language in sponsorship contracts that gave high-level partners the right to withdraw funding if mistreated. Brands took notice. Legal teams paid attention. But the impact rippled beyond the entertainment world. In retail, major fashion houses requested consulting from ReadMetrics to train their floor teams on presence bias. In hospitality, hotel chains re-examined check-in procedures and flagged profiling complaints as high-priority risk indicators. Even luxury car brands began rewriting their showroom sales protocols to include real-time bias tracking. Because when one man walks away with quiet grace, and 1,000 eyes watch, it plants a seed in every system that sees itself in the reflection. And perhaps the most meaningful change happened far from any velvet rope or corporate contract. It happened in a classroom. 6 months after the incident, Michael stood in front of a group of business school students. It was a guest lecture, unannounced, informal, deeply personal. He didn't talk about the festival by name. He didn't speak about the guard or the glitch or the footage. He spoke about doors. Doors that open too easily for some. Doors that never open for others. Doors that only recognize power when it arrives in expected packaging. He spoke about the burden of being questioned in spaces you helped build, and the responsibility of what you do when the questioning stops. He told the students that silence isn't always surrender, that dignity doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just doesn't move, until the whole room feels it, and then it builds something better. That class ended in stillness. The kind of stillness where people know they've just been handed the tools to change something, not with noise, but with purpose. Because that's what Michael Reed had become. Not a symbol of outrage, but a blueprint for reform. Across LinkedIn, Twitter, and boardrooms, the story lived on. Not as gossip, but as guidance. His company's name became shorthand for measured justice. His presence became a quiet warning to industries still clinging to the old rules. He never needed to yell. He built systems that spoke louder. And because of that, the next time someone stood at a gate, scanning in silently, wearing power on their wrist instead of their voice, that gate would open, not out of fear, out of recognition, because the world had seen what happened when it didn't. If the story moved you, if you believe that dignity should never depend on what someone looks like at the door, hit that subscribe button. Share the story, and tell us what you think in the comments. Because the more we speak about accountability, the fewer doors we'll have to break open to be seen. Let's keep the conversation going. Together.